May 28, 2024. Sinaloa cartel leader Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, aka Nini, extradited to the United States on drug importation, murder, kidnapping, firearms, and money laundering charges. Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, aka Nini, led the Sinaloa cartel's ruthless army of hitmen. Damian Williams, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and Merrick B. Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, announced that Sinaloa cartel leader Nestor Isidro Perez Salas, aka Nini, was extradited Saturday, May 25, from Mexico to the U.S. based on the charges contained in two indictments. The first, filed in the District of Columbia by the Criminal Division's Narcotic and Dangerous Drug Section, the NDDS indictment, charges Perez Salas with cocaine and methamphetamine importation, firearms offenses, and conspiracy to obstruct justice through murder. The second, filed in the Southern District of New York, the SDNY indictment, charges Perez Salas with leadership of a continuing criminal enterprise resulting in the deaths of numerous victims, including a confidential source for the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, fentanyl importation and trafficking, obstruction of justice by murdering an informant, kidnapping resulting in the deaths of 8 people, including a minor boy, firearms, and money laundering offenses. Perez Salas was arrested in Mexico by Mexican authorities on November 22, 2023. Perez Salas was presented on the charges contained in the SDNY indictment today before U.S. Magistrate Judge Ona T. Wong. Perez Salas will be arraigned before U.S. District Judge Catherine Polk Fela on May 30, 2024, at 3 p.m. According to the allegations contained in the NDDS indictment, SDNY indictment, other court filings, and statements made during court proceedings. The Sinaloa cartel, the cartel, is one of the most powerful drug cartels in Mexico and is responsible for the manufacturing and importing of fentanyl for distribution in the U.S. Fentanyl is a dangerous synthetic opioid that is more than 50 times more potent than heroin and is the leading cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 49. In recent years, the cartel has been led, in part, by the sons of the cartel's notorious former leader, Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman Lora, aka El Chapo Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, and Ovidio Guzman Lopez, known collectively as the Chapitos. 2. Like their father, who, in July 2017, was sentenced to a term of life plus 30 years in prison. The Chapitos have used violence and rely on a sophisticated security apparatus to maintain control and to protect themselves and their operations as they traffic massive quantities of narcotics, including fentanyl, cocaine, and methamphetamine, to the U.S. Perez Salas is one of the senior leaders of the Chapitos security apparatus. Under Perez Salas's direction, armed enforcers for the Chapitos, known as sicarios, have used rampant violence to protect the Chapitos operation and to demolish unsupportive businesses, capture contested territory, intimidate civilians, and attack and murder law enforcement which resist their efforts. In part under the direction of Perez Salas, these sicarios regularly used military-grade firearms and explosives, including machine guns and rocket launchers, to kidnap, torture, and kill anyone who opposed the Chapitos. This relentless violence has led to rampant bloodshed and taken the lives of untold victims. Perez Salas has also personally committed brutal acts of violence to advance the Chapitos trafficking operations. For example, in or about 2017, Perez Salas, with 2 of the Chapitos, captured, tortured, interrogated, and killed 2 Mexican federal law enforcement officers. In or about May 2017, Perez Salas, with 2 of the Chapitos and others, captured 3 members of a rival drug cartel, Los Zetas, and tortured them with electrocution before interrogating and killing them. Also in or about 2017, Perez Salas and others conspired to kill and retaliate against a witness, an informant. And in or about 2022, Perez Salas and another sicario tested the potency of their fentanyl on individuals, and also experimented on a woman by injecting her repeatedly with the dangerous drug until she overdosed and died. In addition, Perez Salas has personally participated in the negotiation and sale of large quantities of fentanyl. More specifically, in or about the summer of 2022, Perez Salas and other associates sold fentanyl, later seized by the DEA, in Los Angeles. During the course of these sales, among other things, Perez Salas described that he owned his own fentanyl labs and that 3 fentanyl cooks from one of his labs had recently died from sampling the product because it was so potent. Finally, most recently, in or about October 2023, Perez Salas, and other sicarios acting at his direction, kidnapped a DEA confidential source and 10 other victims in Mexico, including a U.S. citizen whom Perez Salas believed worked for or were related to the confidential source. Perez Salas and his sicarios killed 8 of the kidnapped victims, including the DEA confidential source and a 13-year-old boy. Perez Salas kidnapped and killed these victims in retaliation for the confidential source's provision of information to the DEA in connection with the investigation of Perez Salas and his associates in the Southern District of New York. Perez Salas, 32, a Mexican national, is charged in the SDNY indictment with 1 count of participating in a continuing criminal enterprise resulting in death, which carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. 1 count of conspiring to import fentanyl into the U.S., which carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life in prison. 1 count of conspiring to distribute and possess with intent to distribute fentanyl, which carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life in prison. 1 count of using, carrying, and possessing machine guns and destructive devices in connection with the continuing criminal enterprise and the fentanyl importation and trafficking conspiracies, which carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 30 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life in prison. 1 count of conspiring to use, carry, and possess machine guns and destructive devices in connection with the continuing criminal enterprise and the fentanyl importation and trafficking conspiracies, which carries a maximum sentence of life in prison. 1 count of conspiring to launder money, which carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. 1 count of obstruction of justice by retaliating against an informant through murder, which carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. 1 count of conspiring to obstruct justice by retaliating against an informant through murder, which carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. 1 count of kidnapping resulting in death, including of a minor, which carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison, and 1 count of conspiring to commit kidnapping resulting in death, including of a minor, which carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life in prison. Perez Salas is charged in the NDDS indictment with 1 count of conspiring to import cocaine and methamphetamine into the U.S., which carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life in prison. 1 count of using, carrying, and possessing machine guns and destructive devices in connection with the cocaine and methamphetamine conspiracy, which carries a mandatory minimum sentence of 30 years in prison and a maximum sentence of life in prison, and 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct justice by retaliating against a witness and informant through murder, which carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The mandatory minimum and maximum potential sentences in this case are prescribed by Congress and provided here for informational purposes only, as any sentencing of the defendant will be determined by the judge.